So we live in a generation of people who church hop and church shop. It seems to be almost just a way of doing things, particularly in the American church. My name is Dan. I'm one of the teaching pastors at Life Fellowship in suburban Charlotte, North Carolina, and this is Life Talks. And we're going to talk today about the issue of when do you know that you ought to leave a church? When is it time to just pick up your stuff and head out, and to do so for the right reasons? You know, one of my pet peeves, I guess, Josh, is that we have this consumer mentality.
Yes.
I often say this to people, and I've been a pastor for 35 years, so it's not exactly personal anymore, but it still feels personal.
Yeah.
When someone leaves the church I'm pastoring and goes to a church down the street, for them, often it's a very casual thing. Like, hey, just, we're just going to go to this other church. We think we can get fed more, whatever. And it's kind of like, yeah, I'm going to go down to Walmart. They're cheaper prices there. I'm going to go over to Target because they got a better selection for people like me. And it's very casual for them. It's just not a big deal.
Yeah.
On the other side of that, as the pastor, I just feel like my wife sat me down and said, we got to talk, honey.
Yeah.
I'm going to file for divorce.
Yeah.
And so
this is your family.
This is, and the other thing too is because of the spiritual nature of spiritual leadership, there is an investment of the heart and soul that may not be present in terms of awareness in other people's lives. So I'm not saying that to get sympathy. Yes. I'm just simply saying is there's a lot of this that goes on. The average person is staying at a church today less time than he ever has since they began measuring these things. Yeah. In fact, right now, it indicates that about people swap churches about every 3 years. Before COVID, it was every 5 years. And since COVID, it's been every 3 years. Huh. Now, you keep in mind that we've got people in our church and every church I can think of that have been there for 20 or 30 years.
Sure.
And so they're going to skew the averages on that. So that means we've got some people that are changing churches every year.
Sure, right.
So I think rather than just ignore this and say, well, that's just the way we are, we ought to ask some questions and kind of dig down into that. So that's what I'm prepared to do, man.
Sounds good.
All right.
I'm into it.
So one of the things I think we just have to recognize, first of all, is that leaving a church is a really personal decision. It is something that we ought not do casual. If you're not conflicted about it, then I would stay until I was. Unless it's like some really clear, obvious thing that's going on, there ought to be a sadness. I see people who get divorced and then they celebrate like a divorce party. Oh, yeah. And I think, even under circumstances where there was justification and grounds for it, there still ought to be a sense of loss, I would think, of lost dreams, lost aspirations and hopes.
Absolutely.
And so when it comes to leaving a church, I would hope that this isn't something that's done because, oh, look there, that's something cool, or oh, look there, they got a new building, or look there, they got cool music. Yeah. But it is something that's deeper than that in the soul. Yeah. With the recognition that people do leave churches.
Yes.
They do go down.
And there's some good reasons, and then there's some kind of lamer reasons. Yeah. And you're kind of bifurcating between those, even just by the nature of making a list of good reasons to leave a church. Yeah,
and in fact, I'm going to also give a reason in our next episode why you ought to stay in your church. So we're going to look at both sides of the coin,
I like that.
So to speak. So
I like that.
Anyway, so here's the first one I've got that I think, what would you think would be a major reason why you should leave a church?
Theological disagreement.
Absolutely. That's the number one reason. So if there's a doctrinal error going on in the teaching, then that is time for you to consider leaving the church. Now, here's the thing about it. A lot of people don't do their homework when they come to the church.
Huh.
They pick a church that's convenient or that friends and family go to. They like the feel of the service. They like the style of worship. And by the way, in many churches, worship style, because worship has become almost an industry. No, I'm going to rephrase that. Worship is an industry. And so you can go to a variety of churches of a variety of denominations and still hear the same song sung.
Right. Yeah.
And granted with a varying degree of quality, I'm sure. But it's still, you got Bethany music and you got Hillsong, and you got Elevation, and you've got these
Chris Tomlin, Matt Maher,
yeah.
those guys.
So you're going to pretty much hear that, but then you find yourself connecting to the church, but you've never studied their theology,
right?
And so
it's all great at the surface level.
Right.
It's great at the first date level, if you will, but you don't know what might be going on underneath the surface. What is the leadership structure?
Her online profile looks really great, but then you find out he's been married 12 times and he's got 7 kids.
Even if they show up, hey, she looks great on the first date. I'm just like, what else is there? What is going on?
Yeah, but we got to admit
there?
that some churches catfish too. Can we say that? Is that so they put their best stuff online.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah,
I think we all do that.
Yeah, but then you all of a sudden you find out, hey, wait.
Right.
So, and the other thing too is I can't assume that everybody is theologically aware as a dude that's been pastoring a church for 30 some odd years.
Yeah.
So I guess asking questions up front is going to be a really, really essential part of this.
What kinds of questions?
Well, I think you should ask before you join a church, before you make a commitment to church, you need to ask what are your doctrinal positions? Yeah. They really should have it somewhere in print. Yeah. Whether it's in their bylaws or it's on their website, or they would refer you to a denominational statement, like Baptist Faith and Witness statement in many Baptist churches, Westminster Catechism and maybe a Presbyterian church. But there ought to be some kind of statement that you can look at and you say, okay, I'm in alignment with this. Right. Because if you're not going to church with the idea that you need doctrinal alignment, I'm asking the question, why really this isn't picking your next vacation destination. This isn't a social club.
Well, I wonder if people get that because at least I know I grew up in the kind of the non-denominational kind of sphere, and so I'm just kind of used to there being 900 denominations or something, and a lot of people kind of talk about a lot of the differences between those are non-essential differences, right? And then that there are some essential differences, and I wonder if there are some people that when they hear that there are so many non-essential differences that they sort of undervalue them, and it just kind of becomes why would I care what the doctrinal statement means? We're in a non-denominational church, and all those things are non-essentials. And I think you're saying it might matter a little bit more to be in alignment on those.
Yeah, I would agree completely, and I would also say I think obviously if you're my age at least, the rise of non-denominational identified churches is significant. There's a variety of reasons, maybe for a different podcast when we discuss that.
Yeah, I'm interested in that history.
Yeah, but I grew up Baptist. This is a non-denominational church that I'm currently at, and I'm very happy with the decision I made to identify. But I also can't deny that my core doctrines have never really changed. It's just that I found that in this particular denominational church, 98% of the doctrines have aligned with what I believed and believe and have been part of, and the 2% are non-essential.
Yeah.
But I think one of the dangers we have is you got to ask the question, well, what does non-denominational mean to you?
Yeah.
Because in some cases, it's actually misnamed. They say non-denominational, but what they mean is interdenominational.
Say more.
So interdenominational...
Because they're kind of going in between them, back and forth through
An
denominations?
interdenominational church would say that all denominations are going to feel welcome here, and we're going to be okay with what you bring to the table doctrinally. The more interdenominational church is going to probably have fewer essentials than a non-denominational church is.
Yeah, the doctrinal statement is shorter.
Yes. And in that, there could be a problem. For instance, for me, there are some things that are really essential. Yeah. Baptism after salvation. That's really essential for me. But I have friends who I would consider believers. That isn't the case. Right. But in order for me to belong to a church, any church, non-denominational or denominational, I'm going to have to be in an alignment with that issue.
Yeah. It wouldn't be good for you to be at the baptism services feeling bad about what is happening. That wouldn't be a healthy thing for you at that church.
Or if there was a complete absence of baptismal services or something along that line.
Right.
Yeah. Now, again, You may draw that line differently than I do.
Right.
But I think everybody has a responsibility to know what that line is.
Yeah.
Because here's what our tendency is. We get into the church and then we're in it for 6 months, 8 months, and we say, well, where's our baptismal services? Or why do we baptize this way? Or why do we baptize infants? Or, one of these other questions that may come up. And then the consternation starts and the dissatisfaction. But yet now everybody knows your name. You've been giving, you've been participating.
It's harder.
And it gets awkward.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just like it's harder to break up with someone after you've been making out, like, right? Like it's just, it's harder now. It's just like, I wonder if there's also like a cool, so I imagine for some people, if they're hearing, they're like, I don't know all of those things of what I would currently, like, I don't know what my lines are right now. And I wonder, maybe this is a really good opportunity for you to figure out what those things are. Like, it is actually helpful, I believe. Regardless of where you land, it is a good thing for thoughtful Christians, past the kind of like baby Christian stage, to know the difference between Calvinism and Arminianism and Molinism and open theology, because there's important differences there. And so figure out what are those differences between the different doctrinal statements, and do some research and try to figure out what you should believe about those things, instead of just kind of like going by wherever kind of the wind blows. And
I think this kind of comes to an essential weakness in the Western church, and that not most people, well, it could be, I don't know. Yeah. That a lot of people, how about that? A lot of people don't know what they believe.
Yes.
They don't even know the right questions to ask, let alone what answers they should be receiving. Yeah. And that is a damnable offense that points to a lack of discipleship. Yeah. So for me, I'm going to ask any church that I visit, what is your position on discipleship? How do you approach that?
Yeah.
That's an important factor in it.
Yeah.
Because that also tells me that they do believe something. I don't want to belong to a squishy theological church where it's okay to believe whatever I want to believe. Yeah. I want to belong to someone that is theologically secure and believes in the authority of Scripture. And they can say, our interpretation of Scripture leads us to these conclusions. We would ask that you be in agreement with them before you become a part of our church. Yeah. And you say, well, that sounds very narrow. But the gospel is narrow. Broad is the gate that leads to perdition, right? And narrow is the gate that leads to eternal life. So we have to make sure that, and fundamentally, there I use the word that I'm getting ready to use, these are called the fundamentals. And theologically, and this is going to like freak somebody out, I'm sure, but I would call myself a theological fundamentalist. Now, that term fundamentalist
with a lot of baggage culturally.
And it does not mean what it used to mean for the majority of people.
So talk about that.
I've quit using that term to describe myself, except in very narrow places where I can do what I'm getting ready to do now and explain it. Yeah. By fundamentalists, we believe there are some essential fundamentals. That list is as short for some people as 8 and as long as like 20-something for other people. But there is an agreed upon, and there actually was a booklet put out in the early 1900s called The Fundamentals. And it was when evangelicals were starting to drift toward theological liberalism. And so a group of conservative theologians came together and say, these are the fundamentals on which we must agree. You can Google it and you can come up with the list. And I won't try to go, maybe that'd be a good podcast someday to look at them. And so people that embraced that and adhered to those were called fundamentalists. Now, gotcha. What happened is the fundamentalist core, just like the Puritans and the what was the other group? Not the Puritans, but
give me a little bit more information.
Well, it's from the first and second Great Awakening. We'll just stick with the Puritans for now. Okay. I'll think of it later and blurt it out. But the Pilgrims would be part of that. But they began adding things to their fundamental doctrines that dealt with what became legalistic behavior, what you could wear, what you could dress, what you could say, what you could do on Sundays. The
list of fundamentals got longer and
longer and longer. And yet, in order to, the fundamentalists tried to out-purify themselves among their peers, and so they just got more and more.
Kind of always happens in groups, right?
Yeah, eventually. Absolutely. It happens, and I actually grew up in that. And we never got to actually burning witches, but there, that's where you end up at some point. You make accusations. Right. And to some extent, the Catholics did this with the Inquisition.
Yeah, I mean, the Protestants and the Catholics burned each other at the stake at various places in history. It's like some of the worst stuff. Thinking about, absolutely.
So in their search for search for doctrinal purity, they missed biblical philosophy. Yeah. So anyway, going
the heart of Jesus.
We're just dancing all around this first one, but there's just so much thing. You need to know what what your church believes that you're considering joining, and you need to know what you believe and make sure they're in alignment. For 14 years here, I taught the LifeQuest class. And it was always interesting to me to have people come in and say, well, we're considering joining your church. What church background you come from? I'm from a Roman Catholic background.
Interesting.
Or I'm from an Anglican or Episcopalian, or I'm from a United Methodist background even.
But they're saying it just as if they're saying, I just used to go to a church across the country.
Yeah, I used to live in Virginia, and now I'm living in North Carolina.
And those are significant different experiences.
There are significant differences. So
beliefs.
I would want to sit down with them, because sometimes I would say, and growing up in this denomination, I realized that I did not believe what they believed, and I had an experience with Christ, and I've turned over a new page, a new leaf in my spiritual journey, and now that's why I'm here. Okay, that makes sense. Right. But if they're saying, and we moved to this community, we saw this church on the highway, it's got cool buildings, so we thought we'd give you a try, then I go, okay, now for me, I don't get upset at that, but I see it as an opportunity to have a more substantive conversation.
Right.
So without beating this to death even more.
Yeah, since we're definitely going to do multiple parts, I'm interested in number 2 on the list.
Yeah, so, and for me, that is a lack of integrity in leadership in regard to sin.
Yeah. This is really important.
Yeah, and I think this is really important today in Western church history. There are websites out there that are devoted to exposing unrepentant sin in leadership, or even repented sin that's been covered. Quite frankly. If you've been watching the news over the last several months, and this is being filmed in the fall of 2024 and recorded, but over the last probably 8 or 10 months, there have been a dozen or more megachurch pastors in the Dallas metropolitan area who have been forced to resign, the vast majority for sexual immorality, but for others for other really egregious things.
Oh, wow. I don't know about at least most of this.
Yeah,
wow.
It's sad. But there was one who literally, this was a situation where the guy who was pastoring had committed this crime. It was a sexual crime, had committed it probably 30 or 40 years ago, and then covered it. But the leadership was aware of it, and they covered it as well.
Oh, my gosh.
Now,
and we get mad at the Catholic Church when they do that.
Oh,
it's
yeah. And that's one thing we always have to be careful when we're judging other groups is that we better be careful. We better sure everything's good at home as well. But one of the things is that there's a process for making accusations against elders. That's found in 1 Timothy chapter 5. And but the issue is there is a process.
Yes.
And so if there's a process, that means there is the potential for a problem, and that the problem shouldn't be ignored. The problem should be addressed.
Yeah.
And if an elder is found guilty of sin, depending on what the sin is, it could be a disqualifying thing. It could be necessary for a rebuke. Now, Paul did this with Peter. Peter kind of got off, very early on in his spiritual leadership. He kind of got off a target. Yeah. And so Paul called a council and publicly rebuked him, and Peter repented and got back on track. And that may be the case.
Only that happened a lot more often now, right?
Well, I'm convinced that if it happened more often with leadership showing how that's done, that we would have less of it in the pews, so to speak.
Yeah,
nobody uses pews anymore. Right. But Jesus himself in Matthew 18 outlined the process of addressing sin among believers in the church and how we should seek restoration, that we should do it in humility and so forth. So I would just simply say, if you're aware of a scandal. Now, again, this isn't, I found out my pastor speeds, or I found out that they had a glass of wine on their anniversary or something. Okay, that may be a sin. And we'll, there are categories of sins, and you can't say that all sin is equal, because it's not. If you kick a duck and you kick a baby, you're going to have two different reactions.
I mean, you've got Jesus telling Pontius Pilate, they who brought me here did the bigger sin. Like, if that's not enough for people, I don't know what is. Exactly.
So there are disqualifying sins, though. I think those are pretty clear in Scripture, based on Titus and Timothy as well. But if it's just not, if it's covered up, if it's not addressed. By the way, it may be investigated and you don't like the way the investigation turned out. You were convinced of their guilt.
Right.
You've got another dilemma, because if the investigation has been followed, and because people do make false accusations. I had a false accusation made of me 25, 30 years ago. I asked for a church council to investigate it. They found me innocent. They found the other person.
It's typically what innocent people do.
Yeah.
Come, investigate, please.
Yeah. They found the other person guilty, and they demanded of him an apology. The guy looked me dead in the eye, said, "I am sorry. I believed a lie. Will you please forgive me?" Wow. Shook my hand, and we're friends to this day.
Wow. See, that's how it's
that's the way it should go. That's the way it goes. I mean, this gentleman handles my finances. Yeah. But he believed something that wasn't fundamentally true. Somebody had told him. Yeah. And the investigation occurred. And I didn't like that. I was offended. It bothered me. But when he said, "I was wrong, will you forgive me?" then I had a responsibility to respond biblically.
Yes.
So
how should this not be done? What are some of the ways that this is, because like here's what's going on in my head. So in my work as a full-time pro-life advocate speaker guy, I end up hearing stories of things that have gone badly in the church, like in the past. Mm-hmm. For example, with women getting pregnant out of wedlock, and like there's like a common story I know of women being kind of brought to the front of literally church on Sunday morning to like have to apologize because they had sex out of wedlock. Usually no one's talking to the boyfriend. He's over in the pew still. Mm-hmm. So it's like, because those kinds of things are in people's heads, I want you to distinguish between kind of the, like that kind of thing, which doesn't really happen much anymore, at least that I'm aware of. I know is not what you're talking about, versus this like righteous, like when you've got leadership in sin and going through a process. Can you just kind of talk about the difference between those two things?
Yeah. I mean, I think the scripture does give that, and maybe we ought to do an episode on what does biblical church discipline look like. But the bottom line is this: public sin must be dealt with publicly. Private sin must be dealt with. It should try to be dealt with privately. Yes. Any man be overtaken in a thought or a sin, that he is spiritual, go with the spirit of restoration. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, not everybody in a church has equal visibility. I don't like this, but I live in a glass fishbowl.
Yeah.
I can sometimes use a turn of phrase or make a flippant remark that 99% of the people could say, and nobody will blink an eye, and I say it, and it causes consternation. Sure. I don't like that. I don't like having to live by a separate standard. Sure. But I knew that coming into this gig.
Right.
I don't get to do everything that everybody else does because I don't do what everybody else does. Right. I am a pastor and a preacher of the gospel. So if my sin became public, it has to be dealt with publicly. Because otherwise, I lose credibility because bad news always travels.
Right. And it raises questions about what else might be happening. Like, it's just, is it like that is chaos at a certain level.
Yeah. At the same time, this notion of bringing people before the church for public rebuke, and it has history, across history of doing it. I think in many cases it's been mishandled, or it's been unfairly handled, or out of balance. For instance, bringing a woman up and saying, well, because you obviously are showing the signs of your sin, and you got Mr. Guy out here with an STD sitting in, and nobody's ever said anything to him, but nobody knows it except him and his doctor, right? So that kind of stuff. And I think that's an important principle in that the appearance of an unequal action of justice or execution of the law or whatever is always detrimental.
So I agree with that. I want to just like add on to that though, because I also think like, especially in this case, like a lot of what I've been encouraging pastors in churches to do is like, look, in a case like this, in the case of private sin, it's like you deal with the sin issue in private, and in public, celebrate life the way that you celebrate all life. Because a really common thing of Christian women feeling like, well, if my church is going to come down on me really, really hard, then I'm just going to go have an abortion, even if I do think that it's a person, right?
And I've actually seen that happen.
And it happens all the time. 36% of women having abortions were going to church that month. These aren't just Christmas and Easter kind of Catholics, right? And so kind of like, how can we kind of create a spirit of like, clearly this is a church of grace. We are about grace here, and we love life, and then we deal with sin issues in private in the way that it ought to be done, in kind of an appropriate way, as opposed to kind of this like public shaming kind of.
Yeah, and I've literally had to wrestle with things like that. For instance, do you give a baby shower?
Yeah.
Do you give the same baby shower to a person who has put things in proper order and things who haven't? We want to celebrate life. At the same time, we don't want to give the impression of celebrating or normalizing something that's outside of God's plan. And here's the thing on that, and I don't have it a ready answer for everything.
Yeah.
And because sometimes circumstances are different from time to time. If somebody's truly regretful and remorseful, I say this is the opportunity for the church to embrace them and celebrate the fact that they are moving in the right direction.
Right.
We always celebrate moving in the right direction, should we not?
Right.
On the same time, if they're like, yeah, man, this is just the way I roll. Then
I'm kind of assuming that's not the case.
Yeah, but there's also the other issue is that the smaller your church, the more difficult it is. So I've always been pastoring large churches, except for the very first few years. So most people didn't know what was going on one side. I mean, we had multiple services. People didn't even know they went to the same church.
Right.
But I grew up in a church of 100 people. We all knew everybody's business, and everybody was talking about it. So this is where you've got to make sure your spiritual leadership is using wisdom and discernment and discretion, getting wise counsel, because I do not believe in circumstantial ethics, but I do believe in the circumstantial application of ethics.
Right.
And so we need to be pretty careful about things like that. Yeah. And we are out of time, Josh, and I didn't even get through half my list, so we're going to have to pick this up next time.
This never happens.
Oh, no, never happens.
So surprised.
Yeah, so, well, thanks as always for listening to us here at Life Talks. We'll pick this topic up again in our next episode. We'll continue talking about when you should leave a church and when it is a wise time to do that. I always enjoy my conversations with Josh, and I always enjoy the feedback we get from you. So if you ever want to ask us a question, you can send that to us here at LifeTalks@lifecharlotte.com. Until next time, thanks for joining us here at Life Talks.